Hi teachers, and welcome to this week's lesson gem, focusing upon Monday's lesson, or Luke chapter 5 verses 24 through 34 and Matthew chapter 9 verses 20 through 22. Powerful content today because we are focusing upon, brothers and sisters, the scriptural story of the woman with an issue of blood. Just as a quick reminder, I'll always invite you to go into the weekly overview and read through the overview so that you don't teach the same content twice, or that you're focusing on specific stories when you're supposed to focus on them to, again, avoid that carryover or doubling up. But in the story of the woman with the issue of blood, remember the intent of this video is to help your students to engage, and how can you get the most out of your students. So as always, I have prepared a PowerPoint, and again, I apologize for my lack of skills thereof, but I'm getting better. But I've prepared this PowerPoint for you, and the link is always below with the slides if you would like them in the description below. But today we want to focus on being deliberate with how, what, and why I ask my students to do something. There's always going to be an intent behind it. In the lesson manual or in the teacher's manual, they have intents, and they're so good about putting these little call-out boxes on about here's what we want you to do, and here's consider doing this. But sometimes we don't think through the intent, and we want to follow it like a script. So let me help you to kind of see or be more deliberate in what we are doing. So to start this activity in the lesson plan, it talks about a stretching activity, considers students inviting them to stretch. The intent is to get them into this connection that it's going to be a stretch physically. How does that relate to stretching spiritually? So here's an activity, but why do we want to do it? The purpose of the readiness activity is to get them moving, talking, engaged, but more specifically, to help them engage with the content of the scriptures. So here's an idea. I've given you a link to a YouTube video, and this YouTube video is very simple, and it avoids the distraction of someone who is personally up there, and sometimes the workout videos have people that are dressed inappropriately. So it's just this drawing of a person stretching. So get them up, get them stretching, talk about it. Then have these questions. That shoulder stretch was easy. Did it feel good? Well, what about touching your toes? And those of you who can touch your toes right now, what if you could go even further? And when it gets uncomfortable, I want you to hold that uncomfortable pose for 10 seconds. And what would happen if you did this every day? And so you go through this activity with them, but you remember, why are you doing it? If you've done the activity well, it has taken less than 5 minutes, and your students were up and engaged, and now you transition right to the content. And that's my little transition cue. Here's your teacher's manual question. What does it mean to spiritually stretch? So if I go into the teacher's manual, here is that question right here. And so let's get right into the content. So remember the intent to be deliberate with what you're doing at the readiness activity. So let's continue with how could we be more deliberate in what we do? So next, we are going to ask questions, and we're going to transition from physical stretching to spiritually stretching. And in the teacher's manual, it asks you to read through these and possibly use Leviticus 15, 19 through 33 as context. And if you read through that context in Leviticus, it gives you why it was such a big deal to have an issue with blood, how you would be ritually unclean, how you would have to separate yourself, you would have to wash, all the conditions thereof, and the amount of days and time that you had to be separated. So this is great context on how the woman with the issue of blood must have felt for 12 years, as we read in verse number 25 of Mark chapter 5. But please, as a warning, this content in Leviticus is difficult or hard to understand and a little bit weird. So are we doing a ceremonial cleansing lesson or a lesson on the power and mercy and love of the Savior Jesus Christ? So when we are presenting the context, sometimes it's great to go to the verses and read it. But in this case, I would invite you to just summarize it. According to Mosaic law, anyone with an issue of blood was ritually unclean, and word it how you would, but don't go to the verses because it might put you on a derailment of what you're trying to focus on. And the focus is, Jesus Christ can heal me. The intent of the story of the woman with an issue of blood is that he can heal me. And if he healed the woman, he can heal me. So let's ask a question to get back to our desired content. So how long did this woman suffer? As in Mark chapter 25, go back, Mark chapter 5, verse 25. Now, have you ever felt like you didn't belong or you were excluded? Now, if you have, what can this woman and her story teach you? So let's get right back to our story, brothers and sisters. So a great transition, again, going back into the content, but still using the context of Leviticus. So now, even as an outcast, look for what this woman does to stretch herself to reach the Savior spiritually. Let's go to verses 27 through 29. And why would this have been hard for her, knowing what you know about her? Why would it have made her stretch spiritually? Now remember, why am I asking the questions? The desired outcome would be, I want my students to identify what the woman did to stretch herself to receive the Savior's help. I want my students to relate to her efforts. I want my students to see that what Jesus did for her is what he promises to do for me, for them. So now, there's this great ruler of the synagogue versus this lowly outcast. Remember that Jairus was the leader of the synagogue at that time. And remember that Jesus was with Jairus on his way to heal his daughter. It was a very important, very time-sensitive event that what Jesus is doing. So what do we learn about Jesus Christ in verses 30 through 34? What would it teach them that Jesus Christ would stop and make time for the lowly outcast? And so remember, these questions above is, what is the intent? What have I done to help them be successful to answer these questions that are right out of the teacher's manual? What have I done? Do my students know how I want them to answer? Do they know I want them to answer out loud as a class? Do they know that I want them to answer with a partner? Or maybe with this question, how does this help you to trust in Jesus Christ, his power, love, and mercy? That might be a question that is more designed for a journal. So brothers and sisters, as I mentioned, I will have these slides in the content below or in the description below, and I invite you to use them if you would like to. But as you are more deliberate with the questions and the activities and the things that you ask your students to do, you will have more success in your classroom. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.